We're starting look at the Sichas Chelek Tes Zayin, volume 16, special Sicha about Purim. This is a longer Sicha, longer than we might be used to. It's based on the Sicha that the Rebbe spoke on Purim, and then on the following Shabbos after Purim in 1964. We'll read it in the original Yiddish. I'll translate and offer commentary as we go along. The Gemara sagt in Megillah. The Talmud tells us in Tractate Megillah. Shalcha lahem Esther l'chachamim. Esther sent a message to the sages. Kav'uni l'doiris. Establish this holiday for me for all future generations. Esther at gebeten. Esther requested Menzel Keveya Zayin Yudalad v'Tezvav Adar, that the 14th and 15th of Adar be established. L'yom tov u'lekriya u'leyois li l'shem. It should be a holiday, a day that we read about this, and it should be a remembrance for me. Danach bringt the Gemara at zweiten Maimer in them. Afterwards, after the Gemara makes this statement, it offers another story, or another part of this incident. Shalcha lam Esther l'chachamim. Esther sent a message to the sages. Kasvuni l'doiris. Write this down for me for future generations. Esther at gebeten. Over here, Esther is requesting, as men soll the Megillah, was is afir nomen. She asked that the Megillah, which was named for her, Megillas Esther, Verschreiben im Shar HaKsuvim. It should be written down, it should be recorded, pen on paper, so to speak, along with other Ksuvim, the holy writings part of the Tanakh. So there are two steps to this commemoration of the story of Purim, at least right over here in this part of the Gemara. Das heißt, Frier hat sie nur gebeten kavuni l'doiris. Her first request was only that it should be established for all future generations. L'yom tov u'lekriya. It should be a holiday and a day that is proclaimed and the holiday is read about. Menzel Yediz Yard, alein in dem Sipur for Purim. Every year we should read about the story of Purim. Es muzar benit geleint werden mitei chaksav. However, this reading does not need to be from a written scroll. It could just be remembering or writing it down or reading it online and so on. Her next request was that the Megillah be transcribed, be written down, and be saved in perpetuity for all future generations. And then it will become part of Ksuvim, part of the holy writings, part of Tanakh. And that's why, from that point on, the requirement became that Megillah must be read from a written scroll. And if you read it by heart, or from any other, or through any other medium, you have not fulfilled the obligation of hearing or reading the Megillah. That's from the Gemara Megillah, Tractate Megillah in Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud. In Yerushalmi Zakter, now in the same tractate in the Jerusalem Talmud, in Talmud Yerushalmi, we read what seems to be similar, but with several differences. Mordechai ve'Esther kasvu igeres. The statement in the Talmud Yerushalmi is that Mordechai and Esther wrote a letter. The sholchul Rabbi Seinu, and they sent it to our teachers. Shekein amru lahem, in which they said to the rabbis, Mekablim matem aleichem shnei yomim halalu b'chol shana chulu. Take upon yourselves, establish these 2 days to be holidays every single year. Das heißt, beide, both of them, Mordechai ve'Esther, both people over here, Mordechai and Esther, who were the heroes of the story of Purim, haben geschrieben, they wrote this letter, und gebeten, and requested, wegen zichron Purim, that Purim be perpetually remembered, nit wie in Bavli was redemont nor Esther allein, as opposed to the description in Talmud Bavli where it says that only Esther made this request. Sholchalam Esther is the one that sent this letter, kavuni, establish it for me, kasvuni, write it for me, and so on. So in Talmud Bavli it mentions only Esther, in Talmud Yerushalmi it says Esther and Mordechai. Ken men aber sagen, das ist nicht aplukte. Sometimes when there's a discrepancy between the Talmud Bavli and Yerushalmi, it seems to be, it often is a disagreement between the authors of the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi. But in this case, the Rebbe says that perhaps we could say it's not a disagreement. In der Tunach, in Ametzias, how can you say that there's an argument on something that occurred, a dispute on a factual event? So it's not necessarily a disagreement between Bavli and Yerushalmi. Whether this request was submitted to the rabbis by Esther alone or together with Mordechai. No, instead of saying that there's an argument between the two Talmuds, rather we can say that each is discussing a different event. In Bavli, in the Talmud Bavli, wegen der Takana von Kriyas Megillah, the discussion in Talmud Bavli is about the establishment of the mitzvah to read Megillah. There's the far touched up Rashi, and that's why in Rashi's commentary on this tractate of Talmud, he says, Kav'uni, what does Kav'uni mean? Establish for me, nitnar li Yom Tov, not only establish the day as a festival, nor oich likriya, but also a day that this is read. While the Iker Bakasha von Esther, Kav'uni, Esther's request when she asked that it be established for her, Liyos li l'shem, that my name be remembered, is given b'shaychus to Kriyas Megillah, was specifically about the establishment of the mitzvah to read the Megillah, Basret Gerufan Ashma, since the Megillah is named for her, Megillah Esther. In addition to this request, Esther also requested, Verschreiben the Megillah als eine von den Ksuvim, Kasvuni, that the Megillah be included in one of the holy books, one of the 24 books of the Tanakh. Kasvuni, write it for me. Und die zwei Bakashas sind gekommen von Esther allein. These two requests were Esther's alone, on their status of Mordechai, without any participation from Mordechai. And that's the Talmud Bavli. In Yerushalmi aber hat sich nur wegen dem Etzem Takana von Kinveh sein, die Yemei Purim b'chol Shana. The Talmud Yerushalmi is talking about the general concept of a new holiday being established to commemorate the miracle of Purim every year. That these 2 days are days of celebration, of feasting, of sending gifts, of food, and giving tzedakah to the poor. So that was the general request that they made, and as is recorded in the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Pashtus Lashon Yerushalmi, the way the Talmud Yerushalmi says it very concisely, that we take upon ourselves these 2 days every year. So since it was a very general request, this request was submitted by both of them, by both Mordechai and Esther. These 3 above-mentioned components of the establishment of the holiday of Purim, which are Aleph, first of all, the general concept of establishing these 2 days as holidays. Beis, Kav'uni, the second one is establish it for me. And Gimel, number 3, Kasvuni, write it for me. And as we just said, there is a difference between these various requests. The first component, the first one was requested by both Mordechai and Esther, and the letzte zwei, and the second group, the second 2, Esther Alain, was requested by Esther herself. Yeshloimer, as in the Merumas by the Gosh and the Megillah, these requests, these three requests, broken down into one that came from both Mordechai and Esther, and the other 2 that came from Esther alone, are alluded to in the text of the Megillah itself. Towards the end of the story of Purim, at the end of the Megillah, in chapter 9, when the Megillah records how the Jews accepted upon themselves to observe these days of Purim, Zog der Pasuk, another verse says very clearly, as it was established for them by Mordechai and Esther. The Nochaber state, but that's followed by another verse. Esther's statement was perpetuated through these words of Purim, and they were written in this book, which is more than just the general establishment of the days as a holiday, but rather over here it was being recorded as a Megillah. These 2 verses refer to the 3 components of Purim that we mentioned earlier. In ersten Pasuk redt sich wegen der Takana von Yemei Purim. Als Teil von Mishta v'Simcha. The first verse discusses the establishment of Purim as a holiday, as a day of feasting, and so on. This is mashma from Lashon L'kayim es Yemei Purim Eila. As the verse says very clearly, we're talking about the days of Purim. As the Talmud Yerushalmi says very clearly and concisely that it's talking specifically about establishing the days as a perpetual holiday. And for that reason, in that verse, both Mordechai and Esther are both referred to Mordechai HaYehudi ve'Esther HaMalka. While the Takana is gekommen durch Zer, b'shut v'zdikr bakasha. They had they submitted a request together, and that's how the holiday of Purim was established. Dakegen in Sveiten Pasuk, but the other verse, the second verse, Retzich wegen der Takana von Kriyas HaMegillah, wegen Ksivas HaMegillah. That's talking about the mitzvah that was established that the Megillah be read and that the Megillah be written. Esther, Kiyam Divrei HaPurim Eila, these words, this description of the holiday of Purim were now recorded. When the words of Purim are being referred to, as opposed to the days of Purim, the words of Purim refer to reading the Megillah. The Far state that Divrei HaPurim, that's why the Megillah uses the words, uses the expression, the words of Purim, or these things about Purim, nit yemei, not the days of Purim. Was meant, beremez lakaponim direid. This alludes to the words to reden und erzählen wegen des Purim, to talk about and to recount the miracle of Purim, lekriya, that it should be read, which is the expression in the Talmud Bavli. V'nichtav b'sefer, and then the rest of the verse is that it should be written and inscribed, recorded in a book. Main das was the Sipur from Purim, the Megillah, the story of Purim. The way it's recorded in the Megillah is verschrieben geworden als eine von den Ksuvim Kasvuni. It should be included as one of the holy writings, and it should be written down. And the Far sagt thereby der Pasuk Maimar Esther, and with regard to that components, or those two components, this is specifically Esther's request. And it's read under Mordechai. Mordechai is not included here. These two components of establish it for me and write it for me were Esther's requests, without Mordechai's participation. Now we need to understand. How is it possible, as Mordechai had gebeten by the Chachamim nor wegen der Takana von Yemei Purim und nicht wegen der Kriyas Ksivas HaMegillah? How is it possible? Why did Mordechai not also request that the Megillah be read and written? Why did he only request that the days be established as commemoration? Nachmer, additionally, Mordechai is doch given a chaver Sanhedrin. Mordechai was a member of the Sanhedrin of the High Court. The Memela is a given von the Chachamim, was a maskim given to the bakashas von Esther, Kavune, and Kasvune. Since he was a member of the Sanhedrin, he was included in the sages who agreed to Esther's request that the Megillah be written and read. Hat doch avade sich gedacht, euch mestativ sein in bakasha zusammen mit Esther. So because the request was being submitted to the Sanhedrin, the body of which he belonged to, why did he not participate in this request together with Esther? So therefore we must say, as by Mordechai Guva in them given very fine. Mordechai wore two hats. He served two functions. Alavi Mordechai is mitzadatzmai. Mordechai, the way he was on his own. Darf nicht sein in von Kavuni und Kasvuni. So the way he was on his own, the way Mordechai was as an individual, he did not feel that there needed to be the establishment of the reading of the Megillah and the writing of the Megillah. And the Far hat sich nicht bestattet given in Bakashas Esther, so for that reason he did not participate in Esther's requests. That's one hat that Mordechai wore. And then his second function was, is a Chaver Sanhedrin. Mordechai, as a member of the Sanhedrin, was does get an order to Memalas and Bakashas Esther Kavuni und Kasvuni. And now, as a member of this body who needs to consent and agree to Esther's request and establish the reading and the writing of the Megillah, that's where Mordechai did participate. Gimel, third thing that we need to clarify. Jeder Inyan in Torah is b'dik. As we know, every detail in Torah is precise. Darf man sagen, as das was the Bakashas von Esther Kavuni L'Deiris. Und Kasvuni L'Deiris werden gebracht nur in Bavli, nicht in Yerushalmi, since Esther's two requests that the Megillah be read every year and written and perpetuated throughout all generations, since that request is only mentioned in the Talmud Bavli, but not in the Yerushalmi. And on the other hand, the bakasha from Mordechai by Esther, the combined request of Mordechai and Esther, that these 2 days should be established as holidays, that request is only mentioned, the combined request is only mentioned in the Talmud Yerushalmi and not in the Talmud Bavli. Since every detail in Torah is precise and is exact, this separation between the Bavli and Yerushalmi and the requests being different in each Talmud must also be precise, and we need to clarify what this precision is. So to understand all this, we will preface. When the Megillah was transcribed, when it was written, Kasvuni, when Esther requested that it be written down for her, she did not consider this to be an additional detail on the general big picture of Purim. It is associated with the actual miracle of Purim. Which is euch verstandig von dem, was die Gemara sagt in Yoma. The Talmud says in Tractate Yoma, Lama nimshala Esther l'shachar, why was Esther compared to dawn? Loimarlach, to teach us, Ma shachar soif kol halayla, just like the dawn is the end of the whole night, af Esther soif kol hanisim, Esther represented the end of all miracles. And the Gemara is masbir. Now the Gemara qualifies and explains this. Although there was actually another miracle that followed the miracle of Purim, that was the miracle of Hanukkah that transpired several generations after the miracle of Purim. The Nes Hanukkah is Geshen nach Purim. It occurred after the Nes of Purim, after the miracle of Purim. The miracle of Purim and the miracle of Esther is considered the conclusion of all miracles, while Esther nitna lichtav, the story of Purim, as it is transcribed in the book of Esther and the Megillah Esther, is the last miracle transcribed in the written Torah. The last miracle that was transcribed in Tanakh is Esther. That is the book of Esther. Das heißt, the Nisim was nitnu lichtav. This means that any miracle that was transcribed in the Torah and in Tanakh, that in Abazunder Sug in Nisim, there are on a different level and a different caliber of miracles. When Esther is their self from them Sug, Esther is the conclusion, is the final miracle that falls into this category. Und Dafke der Far was Esther nitna lichtav, and because Esther was written and included in Tanakh, the book of Esther can therefore be compared to dawn, which occurs at the end of night. As Esther Esther is very similar in content to dawn. Wenn sie wollten nicht gewesen verschrieben, had the book of Esther not been transcribed, wollten man nicht gekannt machen und vergleichen, that this comparison would not have been made. And the reason it's compared to dawn, just like dawn comes at the end of the night, the book of Esther comes at the end of all transcribed and recorded miracles in Tanakh. So that's the preface to understand the various discrepancies we had earlier between the Bavli and Yerushalmi. Der Bir calls that. Now we'll try to take this apart and understand it all. Der Chelek bepashtus zwischen Mordechai and Esther. Very simple difference between the two characters, Mordechai and Esther. In their ufton, in the mevatel sein gzeres Haman, specifically in their functions, as it was expressed in the annulling of Haman's decrees. They each played a distinct role in the story of Purim when it came to bringing an end to the decrees. Mordechai hat sich beikar vernommen mit me'eure sein iden tshuva zu tun. Mordechai's primary function was to inspire Jews to repent after the Averis was haben der Fir zu the Gzeres Haman, to repent for the sins that led to this decree. When he gathered all the Jews and told them to fast, which was told to him, Esther hat es ihm gebeten tan. This Esther was the one that requested that he gather the Jews and tell them to fast. So really it came from Esther. He was the one that brought it out into actuality, and he's the one that made it happen. Kegen Esther, but on the other hand, Esther, Esther was living in the king's palace. She did not reside among her fellow Jews at that time. She reached the level of elitism, and Mordechai tells her that this is the reason you arrived at this kingship. The only reason why Mordechai keeps telling her, the only reason why you've reached this level is so that you could serve as a savior for the people of Israel. Her function was to involve herself in various natural recourses to lead the king, Achashverosh, to annul the decree of Haman. She came to him without an appointment. She prepared a feast for Haman, for Achashverosh and Haman. And in other words, Mordechai's role was primarily in the spiritual element of annulling the decree, which means that his goal was to annul the decree on high. And that's why his involvement was with the Jews. Esther had getan beikar in their stadlis and darchei tevel. But Esther's function over here was to resolve and annul the decree through natural means. Once Mordechai was able to annul the decree on high, Esther's job was now to achieve that here below. Everything she did had to be accomplished through Achashverosh, until the ultimate goal of all of Esther's involvement was for Achashverosh to annul the decree, and more than just annulling the decree, but everything got turned over, everything was transformed, and the Jews overpowered their enemies. So Esther represented the natural remedy to this decree, and Mordechai represented the spiritual, divine intervention. We can say, in demselben Oven wie Mordechai and Esther haben sich voneinander geteilt, similar to how Mordechai and Esther were different in their involvement as far as annulling the decree went. Their focus on the miracle of Purim was different as well. Zainufta, which was obviously the result of their involvement. So Mordechai and Esther had different types of involvements, and therefore their perspective in what the miracle of Purim was different as well. By Mordechai's Mordechai's emphasis is on the spiritual victory for Nidden that the Jews had over their enemies. Thus was they repented so strongly, this accomplished their repentance, their tshuva accomplished that they re-accepted the Torah that they had accepted at Mount Sinai. Their hadr kiblu b'mei Achashverosh. They re-accepted the Torah during the times of Achashverosh. At the Moidor Rabbi Reisa from Matan Torah that perpetuated the great declaration that they said at the giving of Torah. They said Nasa v'nishma when they received the Torah, and this was reiterated after they repented, after they did tshuva during the times of Achashverosh. Mordechai actually wanted Purim to be considered a biblical holiday, a day that work is forbidden, just like Shabbos and Yom Tov. He even wanted it to be as great as Yom Kippur, Yom HaTshuva, a day of repentance, the day that we received the second set of tablets, which was an indication that the Jews' tshuva was accepted after the sin of the golden calf. Mordechai wanted Purim to be a day of soul, a day of spirituality. Esther's focus, Esther's emphasis was the actual salvation of the Jews and from Haman's decree, which was to physically kill them. That was Haman's decree. So the victory and the salvation was that their bodies, their physical, mundane bodies, were saved. As the commentator, the Lavush, states, the decree was to annihilate and to kill their bodies. Not the souls. And therefore, once they were saved, the emphasis was on a physical, mundane celebration. So that was the difference between Esther and Mordechai in the way they viewed the miracle of Purim. So now that we understand how their perspectives differed in the way they viewed the miracle, now we will also see how they also differed in the way they commemorate this miracle. Is the bakasha from when they requested that these 2 days be established as days of commemoration for this miracle, that request came from Mordechai and Esther. Und die bakasha is kavuni nor from Esther alone, and the request that it be written and read, that came only from Esther. While indeed because through these 3 components, as we discussed earlier, the miracle of Purim is expressed in various methods. By Mekayim Zayin Yemei Purim, when we observe the days of Purim, we commemorate the day of Purim through practical, actual mitzvahs. We have a feast, we give gifts of food, we give tzedakah. So they are practical, down-to-earth mitzvahs. Is in Yonam Bepashtus, practically speaking, their purpose is as durch zei sollen in b'machshavtam benafsham kumen zum zikaron hanes, that should lead the Jews in their minds, in their thoughts, to recall the miracle. So it's more of a spiritual component. When you observe the day of Purim, that leads you to remember the miracle. But when Esther requested that it be established for her, lekriya, that it be read, that leads the miracle to be expressed now through speech. When the Megillah is read, when the Megillah is recited, moving your lips is considered action. So that's the first step in bringing the Megillah down into practical action, to bringing the commemoration of the miracle into speech, into verbalizing the commemoration of the mitzvah. But that's one step. Aber von deswegen is Dibur Belois am Meise Zuta. Speech is considered a minor action. That's the first step. Then when Esther requested that the Megillah not only be read and recited, but also written, in Meiser Rabbi. Now the miracle of Purim can be drawn down into a major action. Der Nezret verschrieben b'dyoy gashmi of klav gashmi v'chulu. Now the entire miracle is being recorded with physical ink on a physical parchment and so on. It brings it as far down to earth as possible. Und der Riber. Now, by Mordechai, from Mordechai's perspective, was der Hadgoshes Anas is by him der Nitzachen Ruchni, he focused on the spiritual victory. When it comes to commemorating the miracle, he also had more of a spiritual perspective, and said that it has to be done in your mind, in your thought. Ruchni should mention, which is a man's most spiritual level. He also wanted Purim to be established as a day that you may not work. But conversely, Esther's perspective was the Hadgoshes Anazes of the Hatola Kipshuta. She focused on the physical salvation. Hatolas Aguf Gashmi, their physical bodies were saved. Und der Riber is der Riber nicht genug, as a Zichron Anaz soll sein in Machshava. Remembering the miracle in your mind is not sufficient. Nor is it must come down into practical action. In Maisa Zutta, first in minor action, then in Maisa Rabba, and then in major, great action. Reading it and writing it. Das was Mordechai hat nor gebeten mekablim mate malechim shnei yom halalu. Now Mordechai, when he participated in the request, only requested that the days be established. Nit kavuni kasvuni. He didn't have any interest in it being read and written. It does be Mordechai mitzad mailas mitzad mate mailas atzmai. Now, as we said earlier, Mordechai wore several hats. So from his perspective as an individual, the one person, Mordechai, he did not see a need for there to be a a reading and a writing of the Megillah. As an individual, he sees his own generation. He was their leader. He was the spiritual leader and the one who brought them all of their spiritual life and vitality. So he saw the Jews from his perspective. All he saw in a Jew was their spirituality, their soul. So from that perspective, it is sufficient for the commemoration of the miracle to be done in thought. There isn't that much of a need for there to be practical action. But then you have Mordechai, who wears the hat of a member of the Sanhedrin. And all difficult things are now being presented to the Sanhedrin. They have to deal with the day-to-day mundane matters of the Jewish people. And in the Sanhedrin is to paskin in the din lamaisa. And the Sanhedrin's role was to determine what the halacha, the practical halacha, the practical determination of the law. Was to leave them darfen sie sich herablassen ziden und sen sehr matziv in elam agashmi. So from that perspective, they can't remain on their elite level. Mordechai can't remain just as a spiritual leader who sees only the spirituality of the Jewish people. He has to bring himself down. The Sanhedrin needs to bring themselves down and view the world from their mundane physical perspective, mitzad gufam, the way their bodies operate. And their psak halacha darf durchgeführt werden in Meise, and their halachic determination now needs to be accepted and carried out in practical action. They can't remain spiritual. So from that perspective, he views Jews as within their physical existence. So from that perspective, the only way to properly commemorate the miracle is through practical action. Only that can permeate can completely permeate the body. So Mordechai, the way he is as Mordechai, only needed spirituality. But Mordechai, the way he was as a member of Sanhedrin, accepted Esther's request that the mitzvahs of Purim be brought down into practicalities, and more specifically the mitzvah of reading and writing the Megillah. Now that we understand the difference between Mordechai and Esther on a seemingly practical level, we'll explain this more from a Hasidic perspective, using parlance and language often associated with Kabbalah and as elucidated in the teachings of our Hasidic masters. The chiluk zwischen Madreges Mordechai and Madreges Esther. The Kabbalistic difference between Mordechai and Esther. Mordechai is Inyoni. Mordechai represented Yisoid Abba, literally meaning the foundation of our father. Mitzad Abba in Hasidic, in Kabbalah is a reference to Sfiras HaChachma. It represents Chachma, which is the first of the spheres, the first of the spiritual attributes of godliness. So from that perspective is Negeya der Inyan HaOyer. Light and revelation is really all that matters. As far as Chachma is concerned, which is the first level of the Seder Ishtalshalos, of the various incarnations of godliness through this within our universe, all that really matters is light and revelation. Esther is on the opposite end of the spectrum. Esther is Sfiras HaMalchus. Esther represents Malchus, kingship literally, when in Dem Gufa, and within Malchus itself, the Malchus is Yeredes in Eilam is Biyah. The Malchus also has various iterations. There are 4 general worlds. There's Atzilus, which is the most spiritual world, and then there's Biyah, Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya, which are the lower worlds. And in each one of these worlds, you have 10 spheres, Chachma being the first and Malchus being the last. So not only does Esther represent Malchus within the world of Atzilus, the higher world, but she represents Malchus in the way it is manifest in Biyah in the lower worlds. This is Merumas in her nomen Esther. Esther's name itself also alludes to this. When the Torah says that God says, I will conceal myself, the word haster, aster, is an allusion to the name Esther, and Esther represents Tachlis HaHelam VeHester, the ultimate concealment of godliness in the world. Was mitzad sfiras ha-malchus is negeh der inyan ha-kelim. So, as far as malchus, as far as the spiritual level of malchus is concerned, all that matters right now is the container that receives this light. So Chachma represents the light, and all Chachma really cares about is this revelation. And Malchus's goal is to receive this light in a container, in a kli. Der Chelek zwischen dem Eufen wie Nes Purim wird erhört mit dem Inyan von Inyan ha'oir, und is nirgish mitzad ha'kelim. So now we need to understand how the miracle of Purim is appreciated from the perspective of light and from the perspective of the container that receives the light. Der Nes Purim, zayndik von den Nisim ha'mulubashim b'teva, since the miracle of Purim occurred down on this world and is a very mundane, it seems to have been a very mundane and natural occurrence. Hatten sich zwei ktavas. It is composed of two, what seem to be opposite components. Von ein Seite, on one hand, wie bald as der Nes is angetan in Teva, since this miracle, the miracle of Purim, occurred in a very natural form, in Anoif and Shaloy Davanir La'ayin, Shuhulam Ailam Teva, nothing in the story of Purim seemed to be supernatural. Everything seemed to be very natural, as we know in the story of Purim, is moving as is verbunden mit dem Eure Lekivus kommt herab ist Lapsus in the Welt. It is therefore associated with this godly revelation, this godly light, which comes down into this world and clothes itself in this world, and we don't necessarily see it. Von der zweiter Seite, on the other hand, since it is a miracle, and as we know, miracles are expressions of and revelations of godliness, after the story of Purim occurred. In retrospect, everything was very clearly above nature, is moving, as the Shirish from the Nes is from the Eure Lekivas is Hecher from Teva. The source, the root of the miracle of Purim was from a level that is far greater, far beyond anything that nature itself can create. Unochmer. Also, does Guva was der Nes can herabkommen in Teva, the fact that the miracle itself is able to descend and come down into this world is a bavais. This is an indication as beshorshoy is hecher euch von den Nisim gluyim. The root of these miracles is far greater than miracles that are obvious miracles. So you have miracles that are obvious, like the splitting of the sea, Kriyas Yamsuf, for example. That's an obvious miracle. Then you have miracles that are enclosed in nature, like the story of Purim, and now we say that the only way this godly revelation can come down into this world is if it is greater than the godly revelation that leads to revealed miracles. But the Ribber is nit mugbal in the Akbala von Hecher von Teva. To say that something is beyond nature is also somewhat limiting. And now this light, this godly revelation, is so great that it could be revealed even within nature. If you say that a certain godly light can only be revealed in a higher than nature form, then you're limiting the ability of this godly light. But if you say that it can also be revealed within the physical world, within nature, that is an expression of God's infinite nature. Und das ist der Chiluk zwischen dem Nes Purim, wie is mitzad Oir und wie is mitzad Kelim. So now, back to the story of Purim, to the miracle of Purim, in how it is viewed from the perspective of the light and how it is viewed from the perspective of the container of this light. The oir, the light, causes the actual revelation, the actual miracle. That is the miracle in its purest form, in its root and its source. The Inyan von Kelim is to herabtragen dem Nes in Helen v'Hester von Levushei Teva. But the purpose of the Kelim, the purpose of these containers that receive the light, is to bring the light down into the lowest levels, into the concealment of nature. Was in dem which is really the entire purpose of the Nes, of this miracle. To transform the concealment of nature, as mizol zen v'teva v'ed gefiert from Eibishter allein, until we can see it becomes completely apparent that even nature is controlled by God Himself. And this is the Chelek zwischen Mordechai and Esther. And this was the ultimate difference between Mordechai and Esther. Tzad Mordechai Inyana Oyer, since Mordechai represented Oyer and light, is there Iker Adgasha Funes Purim, the primary emphasis of Purim, of this miracle of Purim, Nitin Zichu Chateva, is not about refining nature, nor Nisgalos Oyer. All the level of Oyer cares for, all this level of revelation cares for, is for there to be a revelation of the light. Das was durch den Nesvet Nisgala de Bligvul Amiti Izbarach. This level wants there to be a revelation of God's infinite essence. And it allows this, it desires for this level of revelation to reach the lowest levels, even into the daily activities and the daily function of nature. And therefore, when it comes to commemorating the miracle, practical action is not so relevant. Es ist genug, was der Zichron an es drückt sich aus in the mitzvahs meises von Purim. It would be sufficient from this perspective for the miracle of Purim and for the commemoration of the miracle of Purim to be expressed through basic mitzvahs. Aber der Zichron as Gufa can bleiben machshava v'ruchnis. The actual remembering of the Nes, remembering the miracle, can be in thought. It can remain theoretical. So even the mitzvahs of Purim that we do perform according to this perspective, from the perspective of the light, are only meant to lead you to then recall and commemorate Purim in your mind. And that's why this request that was made is mentioned specifically in Talmud Yerushalmi, not in the Bavli. Was in Torah Gufa is as der Inyan Oyer. Within Torah, Talmud Yerushalmi represents light. All the answers are reached immediately. All the discussions are usually omitted, and you have the answers right away. It's like someone who sees something in the light. If you see something in the darkness, you need to try to figure out what it is you're seeing. You need to analyze it. But if you see something in daylight, then you have no need for any long discussions and any analytics. That's what the Talmud Yerushalmi represents. Tzad Esther Aber, but from Esther's perspective, Inyan HaKelim, Esther represents the receptacle, the container. Haster, Aster, the concealment of the light, is der Iker Adgasha von Es Purim, das was durch dem wird übergemacht im Hester von Choshech von Teva. From her perspective, the purpose and the goal in commemorating the miracle of Purim is for the nature of the world to be transformed into something greater, transforming the light into darkness. The fact is, and that's why, from her perspective, when we commemorate the miracle, it has to be expressed in the physical world of action. In Kriya, in Ksiva, it has to be read, it has to be recited and written. That's the only way we can fulfill the true purpose of the miracle, which was as Teva Gufa Zal Meir Zayin, that nature itself should shine and receive this godly light. And that's why Esther's request was specifically mentioned in the Talmud Bavli. Now, Talmud Bavli is referred to as B'machshakim Hoshivani, where I sit in darkness. Zeh Talmud Shel Bavel, this refers to the Babylonian Talmud, which is not a negative thing, as is der Inyan von Birur HaChoshech. The Talmud Bavli represents the refinement of the darkness in Torah Gufa. So there are areas in Torah that need to be refined, and that is accomplished through study of Talmud Bavli. Again, another difference, and the ultimate difference between Esther and Mordechai is in what the purpose of the commemoration of the miracle of Purim is. Mordechai says it's all about the spirituality, and Esther says it's all about the practicality. Al pi kol hanal. Now that we've explained and we understand the difference between Mordechai and Esther on a spiritual level, we'll also understand why Esther is compared to dawn, which we said earlier that Ma Shachar Seif Kol Alayla Af Esther Seif Kol Anisim. Just like the dawn represents the end of the night, Esther represents the end of all miracles. Wie das ist verbunden mit dem, was Esther nicht nur lichtet. Specifically, as we said earlier, because the scroll of Esther, Megillas Esther, was allowed to be written. It's the last miracle that is transcribed in Tanakh. Das was die Gemara vergleicht Kol Halayla to Seif Kol Halayla to Seif Kol Hanisim. When the Talmud compares the end of the night to the end of all miracles, is perplexing. Miracles and night seem to be complete opposites. And the commentator, the Marsha, actually asks this question: how can we compare night to miracles? He says, as we said earlier, their tachlis von anes is as the teva soll sich ändern. The purpose of all miracles is for nature itself to be altered. As in teva, within nature, was mitzad atzmai, is an inyan von Laila v'choshech. Nature represents night and darkness. Soll sich anhören dem Eur v'gilu von Elikus. That within nature itself, we should feel and see an apparent revelation of godliness. So therefore, miracles are compared to darkness, because the darkness over here is not a goal in and of itself, but the revelation and the transformation of the darkness that comes afterwards, which is the purpose of miracles. When Esther, now, Megillas Esther, is Soif Kol Hanisim, represents the end of all miracles. Sie is der Soif und Tachlis von alla Nisim. Not only is it the end, but it expresses the ultimate of all miracles. Arabzutragen dem Nes und Gilui Alikus in Helam Behester Ha'olam, which is to bring a godly revelation into the concealment of the world. Weil sie poilt, the story of Purim and the commemoration as told in the book of Esther achieves nicht nur in dem Choshech von Olam Hazeh, was hat Shayches, und is besmiches Zohar, not only does it achieve something within light, or within the levels of the universe that are somewhat near or close light, the edlen yonim von Olam Hazeh, the more refined elements of the world, nor in Soif Kol Halayla, at the end of the night, as far and as deep into the night and darkness as you can get, in Tachlis HaChoshech v'Helam v'Hester Aster von Olam Hazeh, was hat nit ken Shayches Zohar, the deepest and the lowest levels of this darkness, where godliness is so concealed, that's where we need to reach through this light of Purim. Just like when we refer to the end of the night, literally, right before the crack of dawn, is der Choshech halayla mit meris gabros v'meshach der nacht. This is the darkest point of the night, and that's the deepest and the darkest levels of the world and of our exile. That's where we need to reach. That's where we need to bring the reach of this godly light. Pisa is verstandig, and that's why was Davke die in Nisim was einen Insug von Nitten und Lichtef kann man vergleichen zu Laila. That's why the miracles that were transcribed are the types that are compared to nighttime. Referred to Soif Kol Halayla, or the end of the night, the darkest part of the night. Das was bei Nisim is der Zichron Anas abgetragen geworden in Ksivvasiya, because the miracles, the commemoration of these miracles are expressed through writing and action. Was in Olam Hazeh Gufa is a Sug Hadoimim, that represents the lowest level, the most inanimate part of this world. Soif Kol Hamadreges, the lowest of all levels from Olam Hasiya, and the lowest in the world of action. Is as Valde Nisim is in Yonim to Ibermachen dem Laila. Because the purpose, as we said, of these miracles is to transform the darkness, to transform the lowest of the low. So the only way to accomplish that is to actually reach that lowest level. And that's also why Esther is compared to dawn. The dawn light, which breaks through the darkness of the end of light. This represents a light that is extracted from the darkness that immediately preceded it. It's not that we expel the darkness, but we transform the darkness itself into light, as is discussed in many areas in Chassidus. In Vart Shachar, the word Shachar itself, dawn in Hebrew, is called Shachar. Similar to the Hebrew word shachor, shachor is black, represents darkness. But the dawn, the light of dawn, comes from this darkness itself. Not that it comes after it and it follows, but rather it is an expression and a result of the deepest levels of darkness being transformed into light. In the spiritual attributes, when the Jewish people also referred to a fawn of dawn, Sfiras HaMalchus, that represents the lowest level Malchus, and because Shachar, dawn, is the end of the night, is moving. Das is Sfiras HaMalchus, that also represents the attribute of Malchus. Again, the lowest level. Nit vizis b'mkeimen Atzilus, as we said, not Malchus the way it is expressed in the higher world of Atzilus, or the Rafil viziveret Atik Libria, or the way this level of Malchus within Atzilus becomes a catalyst for Bria, for the next level. Vu der Inyan Malchus is Begili, where we actually can revel or appreciate the light of Malchus, of God's kingship. Nor, this is not what we're referring to, but Viziz Yeredis in the Mhelam Hesef and Oilam is Biyah, rather the way Malchus is expressed in the lowest level, in the concealment of the lower worlds. And the purpose is to transform this concealment into light, as we said about Esther and what her purpose and goal was. Das was Esther macht über dem Helm v'Hester ha'olam. Esther is able to transform the concealment of the world, despite her name representing concealment. Is not only dependent on Mordechai, who represents light and revelation, Esther Gufa, but rather Esther herself, the level of concealment itself, is b'pnimiyusa, on a deeper level, Hecher Lagamri from them Hester, is actually greater than the actual concealment. So the level of Esther that brings light into the concealment is much greater than the concealment itself, than anything that's hidden. But thus is the Pirush HaPnimi in the Pasuk Hadassah Esther. The beginning of the story of Purim, when we're introduced to Esther for the first time, we're told that her name was Esther. Well, her name was Hadassah, and she was referred to as Esther. Hadassah Esther. And Kabbalistically, this means that the descent into the concealment of the world, which is Esther, is Faran the Bechina Hadassah. Even within that level, there will always be Hadassah, and Hadassah, as we know as Elo Tzadikim, refers to Tzadikim. Vasvaisaf Pnimius HaMalchus represents the deepest, the most inner level of Malchus. Was is Meyuchad mit Isfiras Shalamayla Mimenu, in a manner of it being united and unified with the attributes that preceded it. So even though there's concealment, but we're reminded that it is connected to Hadassah, the revelation that comes before. This is a lesson in every single person's spiritual service. Even when we find ourselves in a situation where there's darkness and concealment, you must not become intimidated. In fact, the opposite is true. Because on a deeper level, every Jew is greater than this concealment. You have the power not only to overcome the concealment, but also to transform this darkness into light. Now, as we've spoken many times, everything that we discuss in Kabbalah and the mystical and the secrets of Torah, these all exist, if not explicitly but implicitly, in Nigla, in the revealed part of Torah as well. So this entire discussion that we had up until now represents the understanding of the commemoration of the miracle of Purim through Kabbalah and Chassidus, and now the Rebbe will apply it to a Nigla concept, a practical Torah concept as well. When we discussed earlier that every person in his spiritual service, how a Jew rises above and is on a deeper level greater than any concealment, is that Alter Rebbe Mernam is in Zayin Shulchan Aruch. In Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, he alludes to this. B'Madura Tanyana, in the second version. And Alter Rebbe wrote one version of the Shulchan Aruch, that's primarily the version that we use today. But at the beginning, there are several sections that he actually started rewriting, and that's called Madura Tanyana, the second version. In Onay B'N Hilchas Hashkamas HaBoker, the beginning of the laws regarding waking in the morning, is in the din von ani meir hashachar ve'ein hashachar meir oisi. There's a halacha, and this is how the Alter Rebbe expresses this halacha, that you must wake up the dawn, and the dawn should not wake you up, implying that you should rise before it gets light while it's still dark outside. Und das ist verbunden mit der Tmiya in Taz. The Taz was a commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, and there's a question about something that he wrote. When a shinui in Alten Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch kamo zu Madara Tenyana, as well as a discrepancy or a difference between the way the Alter Rebbe wrote this halacha in his first version with the way he wrote it in the second version. Was wird werden verstandig leuten bitte plimi the Leil Sifid Gimel in Madregas Shachar. We'll understand and we'll answer the question that we have on the Taz, which we'll say in a moment what it is, and also the discrepancy between the two versions of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, based on what we said earlier and the explanation that we said earlier on the meaning of Shachar, of dawn. The Tur was the original contemporary code of Jewish law. And bring that up in Ershon Siman von Chaim, right at the beginning of the Shulchan Aruch, in the beginning of the laws of daily life. Man must strengthen himself like a lion, to wake up in the morning, to serve God, to serve your Creator. That you should wake up the dawn, but it should not be the one waking you up. Like King David said, I awaken the dawn, and the dawn does not awaken me. So that's the Tur. In Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law from Rabbi Yosef Karo, bringt up the Mechaber nor the Ranayb. So the author, Rabbi Yosef Karo, only quotes the beginning. That you should awaken the dawn. Or nitim siyam, but he does not include the conclusion, and the dawn does not awake me. It's Masbir than Taz. So the Taz was a commentator on the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo. He explains, Shachar meint Knesset Kedushas Yisrael. Shachar over here refers to the people of Israel. The Kedusha was the holiness that dwells among the Jewish people. In order for this holiness that dwells among the Jewish people to be felt, there are two paths. Ani meir shachar, either I awaken the dawn, which is the Yisairis milamata of Tukum and Shachar, that we are inspired here below in this world to the extent that we can reach Shachar, we can reach the dawn. And the other method is Shachar Meir Oisi, the dawn awakens me, the Yisairis milamaila, an inspiration that comes from above, from Bechinas Shachar. That Shachar itself, this higher level, awakens us. Und das hat gemeint David ve'ein hashachar meir oisi. So the Taz says this is what King David referred to when he said that the dawn does not wake me up. The Yisairis shaloi milamata, his inspiration here below in this world, King David's inspiration below in this world, Gedola Kol Kach, was so great, she'ein tzarich l'siyua Yisairis milamayla, he did not require an inspiration from above. He didn't need any help. And because this is really something that only someone like David can accomplish, so therefore the Mechaber, Rabbi Yosef Karo, does not include this level in Shulchan Aruch. In his practical day-to-day code of Jewish law, it's not something that most people can relate to. Is l'chura tamua b'yoser. Something over here is quite perplexing. Wie kämen sagen, als es ist da, was ein Zorich l'siyur, Yisairis milmayla. How can we say that there is any type of person, how can anyone exist who does not require assistance and inspiration from above? Without God's help, there's no way we can survive the waves of this world. When Yedin Eden, every Jew, Afilo Atzadik Gomer, even the greatest tzaddik, like King David, Zakmen al Tamin Ba'atzmacha, you should never trust yourself. You should always require and always depend on help from above. So what does the Taz mean? The Alter Rebbe in Madura Kama bringt Eicharab Vida Mechaber, the Alter Rebbe in the first version of the Shulchan Aruch makes the same statement as the regular Shulchan Aruch, as the Mechaber of Yosef Karo. Nor dem Inyan fun shehu meir shachar. He also only quotes the first part of the statement, that you should awaken the dawn. Aber in Madura Tenyana Zakter, in the second version, he adds, you should awaken the dawn, as the verse says, the verse says, I awaken the dawn. And the Alter Rebbe carries out, like the Tur, I awaken the dawn does not awaken me. And then the Alter Rebbe concludes, Vizu mida beinanis. This is the intermediate characteristic. Like a beinani. Is need to move on. We need to understand. Since the second version is also part of Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, is a davar hashav l'chol nefesh. It's something that is relevant to every person. Bring dort der Alter Rebbe in Shachar Meir. You see, why does the Alter Rebbe include this concept of the dawn not awakening me? Which would apply to only someone on King David's level. Nochmer is that to me, the question over here intensifies. In the continuation of the Alter Rebbe's writing over here, it seems as when he says that this is the intermediate characteristic, but seeing applies not only to the general concept that's being discussed here in Shulchan Aruch about waking up before the crack of dawn, but kommt to them. Which is not something that necessarily is not on the same level as real God-fearing people waking up at midnight. It's a general concept that applies to everybody. When he says that that this is the intermediate characteristic, that would apply also to the level of someone who, like King David, is not it does not depend on an inspiration from above. Which would imply that this does not apply only to specific, unique individuals. And because it's an intermediate characteristic, it applies to everybody. Based on the above explanation in Chassidus, the Rebbe now is going to explain this question that we have in Nigla in this practical part of Torah. So earlier when we said that Shachar represents Adosis Knesset Yisrael, Malchus represents the people of Israel, the way they're expressed through the attribute of Malchus, as it is degraded and drawn down into the concealment of the world. So based on all of that, we can perhaps answer our questions. Das was der Taz sagt, when the Taz says that even someone like King David does not require help from above, meint blois as darf nicht ankommen zu dem Siyua was nimmt sich von Bechinas Shachar. I mean specifically, he does not require help from the level of Shachar. We said Shachar represents Malchus. It's the lowest level of the divine attributes. So that's the level that King David does not require assistance from. But he does require assistance from higher divine levels. How does that work? The explanation is in the Siyua Milmayla Yeshleimer and Faran Machlos Drai Madreges. When we receive assistance and inspiration from above, it can be broken down into three categories. First is the Siyua as Mazolit Nichshol Veren in Taibas Israch Monolstan. We need assistance not to, God forbid, carry through and fulfill our forbidden desires, God forbid. When der Siyua is from Bechinas Shachar, the assistance needed for this type of protection is received from the level of Shachar. The Malchus kumt up in Seif Kol Alayla, as we said earlier, Shachar over here represents the end of the night, the deepest level of darkness, der art von Tachlis HaHester von Olam Hazeh, the ultimate concealment of this world. So when a person needs protection and needs assistance, not to falter and, God forbid, transgress a forbidden desire, the assistance has to reach the lowest of the low. Beis, the second category, der Siyua as man soll sich oisiten von Taivas Heter. Now, once we've protected ourselves from forbidden desires, we now also need to protect ourselves from permitted desires. Und das kommt von Malchus, wie sie wird atik libria. That's also from Malchus, but from a higher level of Malchus, the way it is at the end of Atzilus, and the way it is a beginning of the lower world. So it's not nearly as low as Soif Kol Alayla, as the end of the night, but it's still not the ultimate highest level of godliness. Vaschot as euch die Beginne is an Indian von Laila. It's still considered somewhat night. Yerida Olam is Bia. Night over here represents a descent into the more mundane worlds. When al derech in avoda in the actual service that we're referring to over here, kumtes doch zu verhitten von taivas. It's being used over here as a protection from desires. He says, aber nit seif kalaya. It's not the end of the night. There's a you as of taivas heter because the assistance that we're receiving over here is to protect us from permissible desires. That's the second category. The third category, Gimel, there's you of ken oila in kedusha gufa. Now, once you've accomplished that, you're no longer tempted by forbidden desires, and also permissible desires are limited. Now you need help in your spiritual elevation from one level to the next within holiness itself. And das kommt from Malchus da Atzilus. That assistance comes from Malchus of Atzilus, not the way it is, not the way it relates to the world, to the physical, mundane worlds, but rather the way it is in Atzilus, in the highest world itself. Now, Malchus can be referred to as daytime, not referred to Laila as night at all. These three levels of service that we just said. These three levels of assistance correspond to the three types of levels within a person's service to Hashem. There's the avodas tzaddik. There's the service that a tzaddik worships God. There's habeinani. There's the intermediate, and harasha, the evil, the lowest, the most wicked person. The madrigasan wird erklärt in Tanya. As we know, in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains these three levels. A tzaddik is in ganzen nit shaykh zu inyanim von taivas. A tzaddik has absolutely no connection to desires, was nimmt sich von nefesh habahamis, since those desires emanate from the animal soul. Und sein avoda besteht in aliyah in kedusha gufa. So a tzaddik's entire purpose in life now is to keep growing and elevating himself in matters of holiness and spirituality alone. That's the tzaddik. By a beinani is upgefrekte toner na avera rachman latzlan. Now the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya that a beinani means someone who never sins. So he's completely separate from sins. Lo avar avera, he never sinned. Lo yaver lo also will never sin. So he doesn't need protection from against sins. A beinani's constant battle is to protect himself from permissible desires. And Arasha, and the lowest level, his battle, the lowest, the Rasha's constant battle, is to avoid sinning and not violating forbidden desires. And the way the Rasha is able to overcome these battles and be victorious in these battles is with help from above, from the level of Shachar. This also explains the discrepancy that we said earlier in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Mitzad nigla de Torah, forget for a moment what the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya about these three levels, but from a very practical level in Torah, is a beinani, there was his mechza al mechza. A beinani usually refers to someone who's half and half, 50% good, 50% bad. There was a mer von a mechza, and someone who has more than half roiv zchuyos, he has majority, could be 51% mitzvahs, is a tzaddik, and that would be considered a tzaddik. That's not what the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, but that's the way it's generally understood in Nigla. Und der Riber, therefore, in Madura, in the first version of the Shulchan Aruch, was is geschrieben geworden later Hachraf und Gemara und Pesach, in which the Alter Rebbe wrote based on the halachic determinations of the Talmud and of halachic authorities. Bringt the Alter Rebbe the meaning of Ein HaShachar Me'eroisi. The Alter Rebbe does not include the end of the statement that the dawn does not awaken me. As man darf nicht ankommen zum Siu von Shachar, was hit up von over seinen Avera. This level of Shachar that prevents us from sinning is necessary. And therefore, he doesn't say that it's not necessary. He omits that line, because from a nigla perspective, from the perspective of the revealed Torah, every Jew needs that assistance from above, because even someone who would technically be considered a beinani or a tzaddik, according to nigla, still needs that protection to prevent him from sinning, God forbid. But in the second version of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, now the Alter Rebbe is writing it more from the perspective of Kabbalah. As we said, the Alter Rebbe's explanation in Chassidus, in Tanya, that is Eicha Beinani Nishayach to Oiver Zayin Avera, that even a Beinani is someone who will never sin. He does not require this assistance received from the level of Shachar, which is the lowest level. And that's why the Alter Rebbe does not include that level or that statement of the dawn. He does include that line that I do not, that the dawn does not awaken me. And he concludes that this is something that is a intermediate characteristic. Over here he alludes to the level of Beinani as described in Tanya. So in the first version of Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe is talking from a very practical nigla level. In the second version, the Alter Rebbe is talking more from a Kabbalistic perspective, and on that level we know that someone who is a Beinani does not need assistance to prevent him from sinning, because a Beinani never sins. But on the other hand, if it's in Shulchan Aruch, it's something that everybody should be able to relate to. Because once the Alter Rebbe revealed in Tanya what a Beinani actually is das geworden midas kol adam achra kol adam yimshach. This became something that everybody should be able to relate to. Once it was revealed by the Alter Rebbe, everybody now can strive to be a Beinani. V'achra kol adam yimshach. You should strive after this. Every person should strive after this. Kol adam yachol li es Beinani b'chol eiz b'chol shah. Every person, any person, can be a Beinani at any time. And that's why it is included in Shulchan Aruch, even though a Beinani seems to be an extremely high and lofty level. Now, all this is demanded by the Alter Rebbe right at the beginning of your day, right when you wake up. You have to think about all of this right at the beginning of your day, in your morning. Even before we say Moidani, which is supposedly the beginning, the first thing of your day, that says Moidani represents a revelation of your godly soul in you. Even before you have that revelation, the Alter Rebbe makes the statement that you can potentially reach the level of Beinani. It's still dark, spiritually and also practically. Now the Alter Rebbe demands that you should strengthen yourself over your evil inclination, like a lion, so much so that you don't even need God's help. You can accomplish that from within yourself, so that you, God forbid, do not sin. You could, from the first moment of your day, even before you recite Moida'ani, you can already reach the level of a Beinani, and you don't need any help from above to prevent you from sinning. So how is this actually possible for every Jew to find himself on this level at the first moment of his day? Is the beer in them? This is the explanation. When a Jew finds himself in a situation of darkness, it's only because of his externalities. His external features feel and experience darkness. But internally, is a hecher from the Hester, a Jew is above and beyond this concealment. You can also view Dalet binyan Hadassah Esther, as we said earlier, that even Esther is still Hadassah. So within this level of Esther, within this level of concealment, there's still Hadassah, there's still this level of tzaddikim. Ma'adirabah, so much so, the matzah von Hester, this concealment itself, that calls out and expresses the innermost levels of the soul, in the strongest and most powerful manner, and it's expressed through the potential for every Jew to give up his life. But this is bayad and eden. Every Jew has that potential to give himself up for Torah and Yiddishkeit. As it was exactly the case during the days of Esther, Kol Hashana Kula, the entire year, almost a year, from the beginning of Haman's decree until the miracle of Purim, that in Eden event, Bechinas Mesiras Nefesh Mamash, the Jews were in a situation of self-sacrifice, meaning willing to give up their lives and not to renounce their Yiddishkeit, B'chol Yoim, B'chol Eis, B'chol Shah, every day and every moment. Val Mesiras Nefesh, nem durch the mentioning Ganzen. Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice, permeates a person to his core. In Allah seine Keuches, in all of his capabilities and faculties, and even in the most external features. And that which occurred during the times of Esther can also apply to our spiritual service today, every single person. It is specifically and particularly when we find ourselves in a situation of darkness, that awakens the inner part of our soul, even greater than if we have a revealed light. The darkness wakes us up even more. This is expressed through the acceptance and taking upon ourselves the commitment to Torah and Yiddishkeit, which comes from the core of our soul, and that permeates a person from beginning to end. And because of this, because we have this internal and inner light that can now express itself, then, as the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, Yachaliyah is Beinani, a person can be a Beinani who never sins, B'chol Eis or B'chol Shah, at every single moment.